Well, why don't we get started? I'm going to introduce our guest and our speaker, and we're going to have a conversation for maybe a half an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up for conversation, or sort of Jen, Jean, and I will have a conversation for a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to the whole group. I want to start off by introducing them. You know, with kids, you're not supposed to have favorite kids, and you're not supposed to have favorite former colleagues. So I won't say that Jean and Jen are my favorite former colleagues, but they are some of my favorite former colleagues. Jean and Jen and I all were at the University of Missouri together at one time, and I still am there in a way, although I'm retired. Jean is now at UNLV and Jen is at University of Illinois. And Jean, I guess for me, has been a voice of wisdom throughout my experience and just on any number of things. And Jen, a story is we were hired the same year, and I remember they had a job announcement, and they were looking for someone who had both a JD and a PhD, and who's going to focus on empirical research on dispute resolution. And there aren't too many people like that. And when I remember seeing the job announcement, I thought, well, gosh, this was written just for me. And who else could be there that they were going to hire? And who else could be better? And it turns out they found one of the few people who is better, which was Jen, who's just done a phenomenal amount of great research. So I am thrilled to be able to host this conversation with Jean and Jen, my former colleagues. So we're going to talk about this book that they have written, which actually just came out in a second edition, Psychology for Lawyers, Understanding the Human Factors in Negotiation, Litigation, and Decision-Making. And I guess if they were going to do the third edition, maybe they would include mediation in that as well in the title. So let me ask you both, and they're going to have to arm wrestle to decide who's going to answer which questions. But why the heck did you decide to, with this material? Of course, it's Psychology for Lawyers is the title of it. And it's relevant for lawyers, mediators, judges, and law students. What was your goal in writing this?
So I'll speak first, and just to say thank you, John, for that really, really nice introduction. And thank you, John and Colin, for hosting this. And thank you all for attending. This is always really fun for us to get to talk about our work, and especially to a group we've now gotten to know a tiny bit, and you all seem really interesting. So that's terrific. I will give you my perspective. And one of the neat things about psychology is we learn everybody has their own perspective and their own views. So Jennifer, I think, will have a slightly different perspective on the why we did the book. For me, it actually came out of my personal experience as a litigator. So I went to law school and I graduated at, I don't know, a ridiculously young age of 26 or something like that. And then I became a practicing attorney. And I felt as if I had been pretty well prepared in some ways to be an attorney. I'd gone to a good school and I did fine, and I learned a lot of law. But as soon as I started meeting with clients and dealing with the lawyers on the other side, and there weren't that many mediators at that point, but dealing with judges, I immediately realized, ooh, there's an awful lot of stuff I sure wish I had learned somewhere along the line that I don't know, because I'm 26 years old and I just don't know much about anything. And because it wasn't taught to me in law school. And the kinds of things I was thinking about really were knowing more about people. So for example, when I would interview my clients, I realized, oh, gee, they don't serve me up the facts in the quite way that facts were served up to me in law school. People often talk in circles, and people talk for a long time, and people contradict themselves. And I actually first started thinking, wow, you know, maybe I just drew a really bad hand and there's something the matter with my clients. But after it went on for a few years, I realized, well, no, there's nothing the matter with my clients. This is the way people think. So I started to have just a few insights that I didn't know very much about memory, or I didn't know very much about perception, or I didn't know very much about persuasion, and I didn't know that much about judgment and decision making. And I actually had never taken a psychology course, sadly, when I was in undergrad, but somehow I figured out that if I wanted to know more about this stuff that would have helped me in practice, there were people in another field called psychology who knew a lot about it. And then, as John said, all three of us were teaching at the University of Missouri. And on that day that Jennifer was hired, or shortly thereafter, I had this insight that maybe Jennifer Robbennolt would be the perfect person to help me figure out all the things I wished I had known when I was in practice, so that I could better teach them to my students and better teach them to other lawyers who, like me, had ended up in practice not knowing enough about psychology. And thankfully, even without the benefit of psychology, I was able to persuade her to embark on this project together.
Right.
Thinking about memory, I have a memory. I can't remember where exactly we were, but I have a memory of us having maybe breakfast together and starting to conceive the idea of doing this book. And Jean in particular has been fabulous at sort of using the book to great effect with students. So I teaches a class, I think every year, using the book to introduce students to this material. And I think both of us think of the book as a sort of valuable resource for practicing attorneys also, sort of jump in and figure out what it is that they didn't know that they could better understand about people. I also think really that the material we cover in the book is valuable for anybody who works in law. So, you know, whether you're a mediator or a judge or an arbitrator or a litigation consultant, or, you know, we could probably come up with really long lists. I think all of those roles are well served by knowing something about the psychology that affects the decisions that the opinions that you're writing, or other documents that you have to write, settlement agreements, whatever it is. I think all of those legal actors will find the book or the material in the book really useful. So I have sort of that broad audience in mind in wanting to write the book. And then I will admit, as a psychologist, I actually had a secondary audience in mind, which is I sort of hoped that the book would pique the interest of the research psychologists. I think we, in the book, really tried to focus on areas that were not as well trod. So, for example, we didn't do a lot of work thinking about litigation and juries, because psychologists have done a lot in those areas, and there's a lot of other books that cover that ground. And so we tried to sort of expand the scope of the ways in which people think about the links between psychology and the practice of law. And my hope is that might help expand the scope of research that psychologists are doing to some of these areas that are really interesting, and I think might be really fruitful for the psychologists, but that they haven't really been focused on so far. And I think, you know, as we draw a lot on studies that are done with lawyers or in legal contexts, but we also draw a lot on studies that come from psychology in other contexts. And, you know, the more we can do to help develop that underlying body of research and think about what are the things that are characteristic of legal practice that might be different than things that come up in other areas, would be and should be really interesting to the psychologists. So I had in mind also that we might be able to speak to the psychologists and give them a sense of the huge range of things that they could be thinking about beyond, you know, eyewitnesses and juries, which are also very interesting, but not the whole scope of what goes on in law.
Yeah, actually, I just want to reflect on what both of you said. Jean's comments about what you didn't know after you graduated from law school reminds me of a study that was recently released by Deborah Jones-Merritt at Ohio State and Isles about, it was based on 50 focus groups of new lawyers and supervisors of new lawyers. And they concluded that lawyers were woefully unprepared, was their quote, for dealing with legal practice. And one of the quotes they had was, they said, well, you can learn everything you need to know about the area of law, and then you're sitting across the desk with someone who's freaking out and you have no idea what to do. And of course, that is equally true for mediators, although a lot of the mediation training focuses on dealing with those sorts of issues. And in terms of Jen's research agenda or hope that you can inspire other psychologists to and social scientists to do research, obviously law provides, there's so many aspects of law that are important in our society and worth studying. So let me move to the next question I wanted to ask, which is, as you scour the research that you used as the basis for your book, what did you find that was surprising or counterintuitive that people might be surprised about?
Well, I'll take that one just because I don't think Jennifer was as surprised as I was, because she already knew so much. I was coming into this material more as a novice, I suppose, and more like most of our audience. So, what we ended up doing in the book, just the way that the book was structured, is, the first half of the book is basically a pretty quick summary of some of the most important aspects we think of cognitive and social psychology that we believe will be helpful to attorneys and mediators and judges and so on. And so we look at things, we look at perception, we look at memory, we look at communication, we look at judgment, we look at decision-making, we look at ethics, and then what we do is we apply those, and I'm probably leaving something out, we apply those to the kinds of activities that lawyers and mediators do on a daily basis. So as John said, not just the trial, but rather focusing on interviewing, counseling, negotiating, mediating, persuading, whether it be, one-on-one or in a courtroom or in a hearing and so on. And we also get in a little bit at the end of the book to how psychology can help everybody with overall wellness and productivity, because that's useful to everybody. I think one of the things that surprised me the most is credibility, where, I think, like many lawyers who I now speak to, probably mediators are smarter than this, but many lawyers still believe that they can, look somebody in the eye, judge their expressions, judge their body language, and figure out if that person is telling the truth or not. And I believe that when I was a practicing attorney, I was guilty of that as well. I mean, I knew I wasn't always right, obviously, but I thought I had a pretty good instinct. I'm pretty good with people. I have a good sense of who's lying and who's telling the truth. And in the research that we did in putting together the book, I became absolutely convinced that very, 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 very few people, if any, are actually good at that kind of credibility assessment. Some of us may be decent at making credibility determinations about a particular individual. So if we see the same individual day after day, maybe we could tell that on this day, the person was not being honest. But when we're trying to judge a group of people, perhaps that we've never met before, and figure out, are they lying? We don't do it well. And all those things that you read and hear that are supposedly useful about, oh, well, they're not looking you in the eye, or they're tapping their pen, or they're doing this and that with their leg or their smile or their face. Not really useful. So that was one of my big insights in putting together the book. I'll leave it there. I'm sure Jen has some more, but I can come back if we want to.
Well, I mean, just focus to Jen. Maybe you weren't as surprised, but although I wouldn't be surprised if you were surprised about some things, you may want to focus on other things that may be counterintuitive as well, which I think Jean's point was. So what would you add to that?
So I would say generally, I think a lot of the things that we cover in the book are counterintuitive. And partly that's because we chose things that might be things that people weren't already sort of being able to pick up from just being in practice or seeing cases. But I was surprised by some things, even though I maybe was more familiar with the literature. And I should say, one of the things that was really fun about doing this for me is I got to get into a whole bunch of areas of psychology that are not my own specialty. So I did find things that were surprising. I guess one thing that comes to mind that's pretty salient right now is we have a little bit in the book about different forms of communication and sort of thinking about whether we're communicating in person or by textual means or on Zoom. And I'll speak for myself, but maybe also for Jean, that I think we went into it thinking that it was going to be pretty clear that ways of communicating that weren't in person were going to just be not as good. And I think we came away from it, from thinking about the studies, concluding, I know I did, that it's much more complicated than that. And that there are all sorts of different ways in which these different mechanisms of communicating are similar and different, and those different characteristics have pros and cons, and whether they're going to be advantageous or disadvantageous is going to depend a lot on the particular task or the particular parties or the particular goals you have for communication. And so I think we came away with a much richer sense of the complexity of making those decisions and the need to sort of think through the purposes of the communication and the characteristics of the communication mechanism to try to figure out what mix of modalities that one is going to use for different kinds of things. And I found that surprising, to think that it is so complicated. There might be things where doing something on Zoom or doing something by text is actually better than doing it in person. Some people might be more willing to speak up in different kinds of contexts like that. So that was one thing I found really surprising.
Actually,
yeah, I totally echo what Jen was saying on that, because even it's not so, I think everybody would say, oh yeah, sure, Zoom is quicker, cheaper. It's not that. That's not what we came to. What we came to realize was, of course it's quicker, cheaper, but beyond that, in some circumstances, for some people, Zoom can be a better way to build rapport. That's one we were really not expecting, right? We were assuming, I'm with Jen on this. I was assuming, in person is of course going to be better. And you can, smell the chocolate chip cookies, and you can touch the person on the shoulder, and you can look them in the eye. And for some of us, it is better. Maybe it's always better, even for me or for some of us. But in some circumstances, and certainly for some people, it's not always better, even in terms of something like rapport, not to mention these other kinds of aspects of psychology that we look at, such as, when and how should you, can you best share your emotions would be another one, right? Where I would have assumed, if you want to get into emotions, you want to be in person, but it is not that simple. And we actually got so excited about this that we have an article that's forthcoming that is, yes, specifically on point to this whole thing. It's a little bit in the book, but we go into more detail in this article.
I just put a link to our article in the chat. So if people are interested in that, you can click there and see sort of our full analysis of whether and when, and also how to use technology. If you're going to be using technology, I learned a lot about things that are relevant to using it well if you're going to use it. So look in the chat for that.
And speaking of the chat, Jean and I and Jen are going to continue our conversation for another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to have opportunities for you all to participate. And if you want to start loading questions in the chat, Colin is there, and he's going to moderate after I actually probably ask this next question. But before I do, I want to comment that what your comments about the communication mode reminds me of, I don't know, it seems like I've read people have said that actually mediating on Zoom has toned down some of the emotions because people see themselves and they don't want to look like jerks. So, that may be a surprising thing. Well, let me ask my last question, because I think that probably this will exhaust the time before we open it up to people. So I'm assuming that most of the people on this call, or many of them, are mediators. What insights do you have that may be particular to mediators that you'd like to share? So Jen, would you like to start off on this one?
Yeah, I will. So between the two of us, I think we could probably exhaust the rest of the day thinking of ideas here, but I'll throw out one and then maybe we'll go back and forth if we have time. I think one lesson is, it alludes to something Jean talked about before, which is how differently people can see the world, right? And those of you who are mediators, you know this already, right? You know that parties to a dispute are going to have vastly different perceptions of and memories for what they have experienced, different ideas about what's fair, and so on. But I think the sort of additional lesson for mediators is to think about that really broadly and to think about the differences between how they're perceiving what's going on in the mediation might be different from the way parties are perceiving what's going on. Or differences between how a lawyer and her client are perceiving what's going on, or how the lawyer and the client are valuing things differently. And just like any other dynamics in a mediation, those kinds of dynamics I think are really important for mediators to be attuned to and be thinking about how to handle, whether the differences between how they're thinking about it and the people in the room, or between people on the same side of the table, I think is an important lesson, because as Jean noted, the extent to which people's perceptions are so different is sometimes pretty surprising. So that's just one example.
Jean?
Yes, the one that I would focus on is one that we've already mentioned a little bit in the context of thinking about Zoom mediations, which is maybe a combination in a way of emotion and rapport. But I know, of course, one of the big hot issues in mediation these days, as it has been, is, when do you want to have joint sessions? When do you want to go to caucus? And with so much of the trend, at least in commercial mediation, being away from joint sessions, more caucus. And there's a lot of psychology that can really help mediators to make those kinds of decisions in a more sophisticated way. And it's not either or, it's really thinking through what are the potential benefits, what are the potential detriments of having everyone together or not having everyone together in a particular context, for a particular kind of dispute, for particular kinds of clients, for particular kinds of lawyers, with particular kinds of issues that are the most prominent in the dispute. If you really think through the psychology of, sometimes emotion and rapport can really help mend relationships. And I'm guessing that everybody in the room has seen that at least once or twice, where people who were at odds can, through coming together in person, start to heal their wounds. And yet at the same time, it's also true, and we've probably all seen this also, that sometimes bringing people together who are really mad at each other just makes them madder, and they want to start throwing things at each other. So that we all know. But the psychology can help us take it to a somewhat more sophisticated level of, trying to at least imagine, what is it that is triggering this person? What might help this other person calm down? Are there ways that we can, even if we are in caucus, help people perhaps get some of the benefits of what could have been beneficial in some circumstances in person? So, it's not the sort of thing where I think either Jen or I could say, well, I've got the perfect solution for every mediation, here it is. But I do think that coming to terms with, more knowledge of how people think and how their emotions work and what rapport can do for conflicts and conflict resolution, it is really, really helpful.
I'm actually going to ask one more question. I lied saying that was my last question. And it's actually following up about emotion. I did a program recently and I asked mediators what were some of the things that they found most difficult. And one of them was dealing with emotions in mediation. And of course, in some ways, that's one of the things that supposedly mediation is good for. And a lot of mediators, I think, are good at it. And I think a lot of mediators, like a lot of lawyers, want to run for the hills when someone, has emotions. So do you have any suggestions for dealing with emotions based on the research that you've read and presented?
I'll start maybe, and then Jean can chime in. I think one thing we try to do in the book is so we start out by saying, emotions are unavoidable. We all know that, right? That's going to be inevitable, but to think about the functions of emotion and meaning, sort of what are those functions for the person who's experiencing them, but also sort of how might we use them as parties to a dispute or mediators of a dispute, and think about sort of what information are they communicating that someone is feeling a particular emotion. What does it communicate about values that people have? So how can we use the emotion as something that is generative rather than something that purely has to be managed? And then we also spend some time thinking about how to manage emotions, and going back to what we talked about earlier, some of those things are really counterintuitive. So one example that comes to mind is the notion that sort of people just need an opportunity to vent their emotions and then they can calm down. It actually turns out that sort of that kind of venting can just make it last longer and amp it up. And so thinking about other ways to help manage emotion rather than venting, actually, rather than trying to suppress it, that also doesn't seem to be a more useful way, but thinking instead about, how to take a break, or reframe the reasons for the emotion, or, other things that we might do to try to acknowledge, learn from, but also sort of deal with in a productive way the emotions that are getting expressed.
I think, I'm just re-saying what John and Jen have already said, but I think John's point is very true, that some lawyers and some mediators have the instinct to run from emotion. And there's, like a funny article, I think, written by Dwight Galan, who talked about this, and how a lot of mediators just, why did I go to law? I didn't go to law school to deal with emotion. Is the idea of a lot of law students and lawyers and some mediators, right? I want to get the emotion out. That's my job. I'm supposed to be rational. And I think, one of our main messages on emotion is exactly what Jen said, which is, emotions are really, really helpful, can be, but at the same time, it is also true that we all know emotions can derail things and can enhance conflicts or prevent resolutions, so that it's important to both recognize that emotions are your friend, not your enemy, but also come to terms with how best to use them, learn from them, and also, as Jen said, regulate the emotions. So it's a way of thinking about emotions that I think can be really, really helpful.
I mean, for me, one practice tip that I learned in my training was that when people are expressing strong emotions, one thing that I could do as a mediator would be to say, boy, it sounds like this is something that's really important to you. The fact that they're expressing the emotion so strongly. And so it's a way of doing the active listening and validating, and in some ways helping them calm down. I remember doing a role play with someone, and I was playing the mediator, and I said, sounds like you're angry. And she said, no, I'm not angry, I'm furious. And so sort of getting people to express that. So let me turn it over to Colin to see, and actually all of you, to see what you'd like to ask or say with our wonderful guests.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. And actually, I think there is a question from Neil. Neil, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yes. I just posted it in the chat as well. Yeah, I was thinking a bit about the psychology of people during their communication styles in a mediation or a negotiation, because we know that people have different thought processes, different communication styles. And sometimes it gets hard to know whether they are talking in a particular way or communicating in a particular way from like a strategic point of view, like whether they are being reserved and waiting to see what the other party says, or whether it's just their communication style. So would you have any insight as to figure out the difference between the two, to gauge whether, okay, this is just a communication style, or whether this is a strategy from them? And this is all the more so in the online context, when we don't have so many natural cues regarding body language and the like.
My instinct is to say this is a version of what Jean talked about before, that it's really hard to know whether someone is lying or not, right? So I would say the parallel here is really hard to know whether someone is being strategic or not. And so that means a couple of things, I think. One is that you're likely not going to be able to figure that out by sort of observing them. It's going to be more a process of needing to ask questions and try to follow up with them. And the second thing that occurs to me is that might be easier online because you're not distracted by the kind of cues that you would have in person that turn out not to be as predictive as we might hope. So I don't have a really good answer other than to maybe think about ways to handle those sorts of situations that don't involve coming to some, clear conclusion about whether someone is being strategic or not. And Jean might have more to say about that also.
Well, I think I completely agree, of course, with everything that Jen said. I think it's exactly right that you cannot get inside somebody else's head. And the more you try, you're probably you're certainly making some wrong assumptions. A lot of those communication differences that you're talking about, Indra, we could connect to cultural differences, right? So we all know different cultures communicate differently. I'm from New York. We New Yorkers interrupt people all the time, and other people will understand us to be rude, overbearing, uncaring, non-empathetic. And I can see why they would think that, frankly, but I'm really a nice person. And I think Jen's right that the only way that you can even hope to try to get behind that veneer is to ask more questions and try to really find out what it is. I mean, you could even ask, Jean, why do you interrupt people all the time? And that might shut me up. And it also, though, would allow me the opportunity to say, well, actually, I interrupt a lot when I'm really excited about what somebody's saying, and I just want to learn more. And it doesn't mean that I'm opposed to what they're saying. It's because I'm excited about what they're saying. And then maybe we can get farther along in this conversation, and perhaps I won't put you off as much.
Yep, thank you.
So I also note that Rosa said some wonderful things in the chat about how meaningful she finds the book. Rosa, would you be willing to speak a little bit about how you've integrated some of these subjects in your trainings?
And turn your camera on so we can see you if you're up for that.
That's Rosa, please, you're on mute. Sorry. There you go.
Yes. Hello, I'm sorry, I'm in the other activity too, back on told about this, that I learned about this mediation ADR, and the book from Jennifer is really amazing. I have here the edition I want to, and I think that lawyer, it is not possible if we don't know about psychology and neuroscience, because we are daily with people, with their thoughts, their way to make decisions, their emotions, and lawyers don't have training about these issues. I'm talking because my Hamburg house just in Costa Rica, it's center of meeting. I help the psychologist because I think that cases we have can be solved for with the law.
Rosa, I'm going to have to stop you there. Unfortunately, I think the quality of your connection is too low for us to understand. I was making out some of it, but I will pull from your prior comment. I think it's great when you say, let's see, it's not possible to be a good lawyer, good mediator, and arbitrator if we don't know about the social psychology and neuroscience because we work with people. And I love that you said you use it as an ADR Bible and you feel like you're a better mediator thanks to this book. So thank you so much for that comment. I know it's gratifying as authors to be able to get that feedback directly from someone who's read it, especially someone outside North America. So thank you for that, Rosa. Jean and Jennifer, I don't know if you have any reactions to what Rosa shared.
No, other than thank you, and we saw you hold up the copy of the book, so that was very gratifying as well. We really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Rosa. Any other questions that anybody has for
Neil?
Please.
Neil had his hand up.
Oh, Neil, is that the question you had before? Or do you have another question?
No, Anil.
Anil. Oh, I'm sorry, Anil. I'm getting confused between Indranil and Anil, but Anil, please.
Yeah, it's actually a sharing. About 4 months ago, I attended a course on EQ, emotional quotient training, and to be able to coach people on how they manage their emotions. And my group of people who attended with me all turned to me and kept asking me, why is a lawyer who's a mediator sitting here and doing this? And by the end of the program, they actually realized why I was there. It's because I felt that I reached, I've been practicing mediation for about 20 odd years, but as a mediator for about 5-6 years. And I reached a level where I could appreciate what people and their reactions and emotions were like, but I needed to get to terms with that a lot more, right? And that training kind of put me in a perfect situation or perfect position on sizing up people and emotions and how they function and why they function in certain ways. And interestingly, just right after that, I had a mediation with about six parties on one side and 2 parties on the other. And it took place because when the opening statements were made, the 6 parties representative said, I need to make a statement. And he made a statement for about 20 minutes and he read off something that he had prepared and he had not told the rest. And as a normal mediator, I would have cut him off and said, I've set the ground rules and let's get to the point and all of that. But instead, I let him clear out his stuff, watched him and sized him up, and I knew where it was headed to. And then when they took a break and when they came back, they actually apologized and we never heard him say anything else after that. And I didn't have to do anything. So it was really quite a good exercise. So when both of you are describing what you do, I kind of figure, this is really good stuff because it really plays into how you handle mediation and how you handle people and how you watch them and size them up. And, not all of the things that we've learned from mediation is applicable. Some of the stuff that what you all have described is far more important in mediation than the basics of mediation. Thank you.
One thing that makes me think of is I think there's a lot of stuff in the book that sort of pieces of it are intuitive and pieces of it are things that you get from experience. But what the research adds is a whole lot of nuance to that. And, things like, I know the difference between anger and happiness but there's a lot of gradation in emotion, for example, right? That sort of having a greater expertise in sort of understanding those gradations can be really, really useful and might go beyond what you would just get as you learn from your experiences as you're mediating cases. So that's probably a good example of that kind of thing.
I want to add 2 more things that are the things that I learned in working on the book that I think also would be particularly useful to mediators. One is, I frankly forget the name of the psychological bias, but there's a psychological bias that boils down to, it's really easy to see biases in other people, and it's not so easy to see biases in yourself. And not just biases, it's not very easy to see things about your own persona and your own psyche. And mediators, like everyone, and I think this is really going to Anil's point, you know, people, especially maybe who are mediators, think like I thought, oh, I'm good with people. I'm good at learning about emotions. I'm good at reading this and I'm good at persuading that. Yeah, you all, like me, like Jen, like Anil, like John, we all need to learn more about ourselves. And as we learn more about ourselves, we will become more effective in dealing with others. And the other thing that's kind of coincides with that is all of the psychology that I had to learn about to write the book, the piece that I found the very most intriguing and important was the psychology of ethics, which teaches people how easy it is to slide down a slippery slope into unethical behavior, and teaches people that actually the more you pride yourself on being ethical and the more confident that you are ethical, the more actually at risk you are of behaving unethically. And I think this is one that can be particularly important for mediators because, you know, let's face it, my best friends are mediators, and people who are mediators tend to be really good people, nice people, concerned about the world. But maybe in that way, pat themselves on the back occasionally for being good people and being caring people. And in doing so, can actually inadvertently put themselves that much more at risk of that slippery slope that could lead to unethical behavior, whether it be unethical behavior of putting too much pressure on somebody to settle, that would be a form of unethical behavior, or whether it be unethical behavior of actually misusing client trust fund money, which happened to a mediator here in Las Vegas who was also an attorney, or whether it be, you know, inappropriate use of advertising or inappropriate use of communications with one party rather than with all parties at the same time. I mean, there are a lot of lines that mediators can cross that are ethical lines, and I think knowing more about that particular psychology is super important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And one anecdote is that when we first sort of outlined what we were going to cover in the book, we did not have a chapter on ethics. And then somewhere along the writing process, we realized that there was all this literature out there about psychology and ethics, mostly coming out of business schools, that was incredibly relevant for lawyers and mediators to think about. And so sort of we decided it was really important to add a chapter that dealt with those things.
And for those of you who don't want to get the book, although you all should, we also have a whole article that's specifically on the psychology of ethics. And if you just, you know, Google either of our names and ethics, you'll be able to find that article, which is free. So that's.
And in fact, I just put the link in the chat. So
right, Jen just put the link in the chat, so that makes it very easy to find. I see Sue, you've got your hand up. What did you want to say?
So as a mediation trainer for many, many years, I think this is wonderful. My background is also as a psychotherapist. And I always say that in working with couples, we never put them in caucus, that we work with couples in the same room. And there's a skill to being able to do that. The other thing I want to say is that lawyers are some of the brightest people I know, very, very smart. But your head is probably not the place where you're going to learn about emotions. It's in your body. And when you watch your own body and others' bodies, that's when you learn about emotions. So I taught people to turn on a TV channel in a different language. I especially find Spanish novellas wonderful. Turn off the sound and you will know what's going on because you watch the bodies. And that's how you really learn about emotions, is your own body and other people's bodies, not your head.
I took an introductory Italian class a bunch of years ago, just for a few weeks, and even though it was introductory, she only spoke Italian to us, and I was amazed at how much she could convey to us about what she was talking about or asking us, even though I had no idea what she was saying.
Thank you, Sue. That was great. And JM, I see your hands up. What did you want to say? Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Yes. JM, you're on mute. JM?
Well, maybe. Yeah, I think you're off mute.
JM, would you like to talk? Can you hear us?
Are you talking to me, by the way?
Yeah,
Yes.
so your
I'm
hands up.
sorry. I thought you were saying somebody else. Hi, I'm in Houston, and we have 3 law schools here. And the dean of one of the law schools, who's a great mediator, very well known nationally, actually, was saying that the mediation movement lost its creativity when the lawyers got involved. And I think it's funny, especially coming from a dean of a law school. And his name is James Alfini. I don't know how many of you know him.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
You know, I think in many ways, you know, I'm actually a retired judge and a mediator for many years, but I believe that sometimes the people in the mental health professions are much better mediators than us lawyers. So anyway.
Yeah, and just to build on that, it's very interesting. Almost all the people that taught me in my dispute resolution graduate work were social psychologists, and it's fascinating to have people come up that path. I think all different professional paths into mediation, you're climbing up the same mountain, you're just following a different path upward. But I think it does sort of shape the way you think. And one of my early professors, and this rings true for me with what you said, Jean, he talked about reflective practice as sort of looking through a window at night. And you can see what's going on through the window, but you also kind of see a little reflection of yourself. And I think psychology is often something we think about in terms of them. Well, it's their psychology. This is what they do, and this is why they're behaving that way. But that reflective, we just did a podcast on the Mediate.com podcast with Bill Froelich, and he was sort of talking about, you got to be aware of your own psychology. And Jean, when you talk about sort of this overconfidence that people can have, that makes them more vulnerable to falling into ethical traps, or maybe overestimating their ability to connect with people or achieve a resolution. I've had some mediators say, look, I am biased, but I'm biased towards resolution. And I think that there's something very telling about that framing, which is that sort of optimism is maybe why parties come to you in the first place, because they're like, we can't solve this. And the mediators, sure we can. But I think being aware of our own psychology, that's something we don't necessarily talk enough about in trainings. We talk about reflective practice, but I think, but I love the way that you framed it, being aware of our own, maybe our own sand traps that we can get caught in.
That's right. And I know several of you have mentioned that you do training. So for those of you who are trainers, one thing that I have found that helps get at that, sort of helps people sort of realize that they need to think about their own psychology, is to do exercises where I will ask them the kinds of questions that get asked in some of these studies, and then show them their data, rather than just explaining what a study found, because I think it really helps them realize that they can fall into some of the same kinds of patterns of thinking as the people who were in the psychology research study. And when you don't do that, it's easier for them to dismiss it as having, you know, there's something about those people that led them to decide this way, or some other methodological quirk that means that it applies to other people and not to me. And so I found that as a training mechanism, a really good way to get people to sort of begin to accept that they need to think about how these patterns affect them.
Absolutely. You know what, Rick asked a great question, and Rick, I might let you elaborate on it, but I know Rick has been doing a lot of work with online technologies, and I know, Jean, you've written quite a bit about this as well. I don't know, Rick, do you want to articulate your question about video conferencing?
Hi, Colin, thanks. And Jane, Jennifer, I appreciate your involvement, because I think it is a constantly evolving awareness that we have as working with people who whose job we're helping change their minds. How are they making different decisions about their historical perspective and their experience and their personal experiences? And I find that my involvement in various issues also changes, or the issues dramatically change because the parties change. So if I'm dealing with an insurance broker, that's different than a psychologist. It's different from a sibling in an elder care conflict or problem. And I find that all of this is the thread through all of this is emotions and decision-making and the parties involved. So if it depends on the attorneys who are representing them, if there are attorneys, and their predispositions. So I think what you're doing is of immense importance, especially, and as we continue to evolve. So I've been involved with conflict resolution for a long time, 30 plus years. And I find that it's really wonderful to be still able to understand what's going on at my age. Because I think it's a dynamic time right now. I think there's more change and more awareness of what is happening today than ever before, ever since getting to yes. And I think what's going on because of the media, because of things like Zoom, because of various cultures coming together, I think our awareness of each other, our decision-making, our culture, the cultural differences, getting people in the room where they're used to screaming and hollering is, it's imperative for me as a mediator to know what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And I find it one of the critical things for me is to not only what does adaptability mean? What does flexibility mean? What is, when Colin was mentioning that my bias is towards resolution, as a wonderful mantra, I believe. But I think it really, what your work is, Jean and Jennifer, I think is really critically important because it gives us as practitioners some background to go to. So when I am about to approach a conflict with a certain issue and certain parties, it's going to change from what I did perhaps last week. And I really encourage you and wish all of us support for your research in this kind of decision making. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes left. Any last comments, questions? Oh, John.
Yeah. Well, actually, one is a reaction to Jean's point about people being unself-aware about ethics, and it made me think of the Dunning-Kruger effect about knowledge, and this sounds like a Dunning-Kruger effect about ethics. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll probably botch this, but you can correct me, Jean and Jen. The Dunning-Kruger is the people who know the least think that they know the most. So it's a helpful thing to be self-aware. Let me ask one more question that grows out of this presentation I did where I asked mediators what they found most difficult. And one of the common responses was when people come in with unrealistic expectations, which I suspect is a very common phenomenon in mediation. You have any advice for mediators about dealing with that? Yeah, never mind.
I think the one thing I'll say is I think one of the real values of mediation is that it does provide an opportunity where people's unrealistic expectations can be brought to planet Earth. My law students have the false impression that it would be easy for a lawyer to say to their own client, your expectations are not realistic. And of course, everybody who's ever practiced law realizes, while that's desirable and admirable for attorneys to have those conversations with clients, and they do try to, that it's very, very difficult for an attorney to give their client a lot of bad news, because if you really pour on the bad news, you're messing up your rapport with your own client, and they may just fire you, frankly. So mediation is an opportunity for the client to hear bad news in a different way. They can hear it directly from an opposing client. They can hear it directly from an opposing attorney. They can hear it perhaps from the mediator through mediator questions, so that mediation itself is, I think, actually a great fix for that. And yet at the same time, mediators have to be conscious of how to employ that fixing potential, because even though it may be easier for the client to hear bad news in mediation than it might be directly from their attorney, certainly there are also going to be, bad ways to do it that could just end up enraging the client and making them, more dug in, or making them think, well, this mediator doesn't know what she is talking about, and so on and so forth. So I think that there's this balance between maintaining good rapport and empathy, but at the same time helping people become more realistic about the legal possibilities. That's just a challenging path to walk. I don't have a cure other than to be aware that there's kind of a tension between those goals.
Jen, do you have any suggestions?
Other than to say here, here, and is exactly why I love working with Jean, because I think that's exactly right.
Well, that actually may be a good place to leave it. Do you have any closing comments, Jean, Jen, John, that you'd like to share?
Mine only is thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, John. Thank you, audience. And especially thank you, Jen, for agreeing to work on all these projects with me. Wonderful.
Here, here. And the only other thing I would say is we do love to hear how you find applying these sorts of things, and stories that you have about what's worked and what hasn't, and examples you have of the kinds of things we write about, or questions that you have that maybe we haven't thought about including, research you wish had been done, all of those things. So, we really welcome engagement beyond this session. So, send us your comments, questions, ideas.
Absolutely.
I don't know that we
You can
plan a third
find us.
edition anytime soon, but
We're easy to find. Just Google either of our names and you'll find our email. And yeah, please, send us questions, comments, suggestions. That would be great.
And we have recorded the session, and we will circulate the recording widely. So even people who are not live here in the session, please don't hesitate to reach out. But let me just take this opportunity to thank you, Jean and Jen, for this wonderful work, and also engaging this conversation with us. Thank you also for John to propose the session and was such an able host. And I thank you everyone else for attending. This is a great discussion, and thank you, and have a wonderful weekend and stay well.
Yeah, everybody.